All right, so today we're going to jump into a book that caused a lot of trouble in India.
Mm.
It actually ended up in court.
Wow.
Yeah, it's not a theological debate or anything like that, but a straight-up court case asking if the Quran should be banned.
The Quran ban.
Yeah, so that's what we're looking at today, how a holy book ended up in court, specifically for its potential to cause problems between communities.
That's a pretty fascinating question. How do secular courts, look at religious texts and how they might impact society?
Yeah, exactly. And I think our listeners are in a really unique position here to kind of be like jurors in this case as we break down both sides. The arguments for banning the Quran, and then the reasons why the court ended up dismissing this petition.
And to add to that, it's not just legal documents we're using for this deep dive. We're also going to be using interpretations of the Quran and Islamic texts from a whole bunch of different scholars.
Right. So this is a very multi-layered and complex case. Lots to unpack here. So let's just jump right in with why someone would even think to try to get the Quran banned in the first place. And what's interesting is that the petitioners didn't just go with these big general arguments about the book.
Okay.
They went right to the text itself and pointed out specific chapters, which are called surahs and verses or ayats within the Quran.
I see.
So to give you some examples, they cited Surah 2, ayat 193, and Surah 9, specifically ayats 5, 29, and 123.
So they're basically trying to anchor their argument using the Quran's own words, which is interesting.
Yeah, and their take on these verses was that they encourage cruelty and violence, specifically towards people who aren't Muslim. They specifically named idolaters, unbelievers, and even Jews and Christians as the targets of this violence.
They're arguing that this kind of language creates unrest and disrupts peace in society.
Right, exactly. And they pushed even further, saying that these verses are basically preaching an ongoing state of hatred and hostility that can only end when non-believers accept Allah.
Which is a pretty bold claim about the goal of these passages.
So it really makes you think about how we go about interpreting texts like this. Can we really pick and choose specific verses and pull them completely out of context and then decide that's the definitive meaning of a whole religious text?
That's a big question. How much does historical context play into the meaning of these things?
And that brings us to the next point from the petitioners. They also said the Quran basically disrespects other religions and their beliefs by saying things like non-believers are those who think Allah is the Messiah, or reject other faiths entirely.
So to sum up, they are basically saying specific teachings in the Quran can lead to conflict and animosity between religious groups in India. So a ban is the only way to stop this.
Right. So now let's see what the court had to say about all of this. And specifically, we'll be looking at Justice Basak's judgment.
Okay.
And the first thing we need to make clear is that the court ultimately decided to throw out this petition to ban the Quran.
That makes sense. I mean, we're talking about a religious text with a lot of followers.
Yeah, and there's a lot we can learn from how Justice Basak made his decision because it shows us how secular legal systems think about these issues.
Right.
So one of the biggest reasons behind the court's decision was that it's not the place of a court to judge a holy book.
Meaning they recognize the separation between the law and religious doctrine.
Exactly. And the Advocate General, who represented the state's side of this case, said that banning the Quran would be the same as abolishing a whole religion.
Which could violate people's fundamental right to religious freedom guaranteed by Article 25 of the Indian Constitution.
So the defense argued that the verses about fighting were specifically about people who were at war with the early Muslim community and those who broke treaties and agreements, not a general call to attack all non-Muslims.
So it's all about understanding the historical context in which these verses were revealed.
Yeah, context matters. They said these verses were about very specific situations and times.
They argued that taking those verses out of context would give people a distorted understanding.
And they made a point to emphasize the meaning of the word Islam itself, which means peace and submission.
Right. That's a completely different interpretation from the one presented by the people who wanted the Quran banned.
And the defense brought up another interesting point. Only a relatively small part of the Quran deals with legal stuff.
With most of the revelations, particularly those from Mecca, focusing on philosophy and religion.
Right, and it suggests maybe we shouldn't focus too much on those legal verses and consider the bigger picture of the Quran's purpose.
And that bigger picture, according to the defense, is about faith and morality.
Right. The court also talked about a specific author who suggested removing certain ayats to prevent communal disturbances. But Justice Basak said that could be seen as fair criticism and not really an attempt to stir up hatred.
That's interesting. So the court drew a line between critiquing a religious text and actually trying to incite violence against a group of people.
Yeah, so to wrap up the court's decision, after looking at everything carefully, Justice Basak didn't think the cited ayats necessarily met what the petitioners claimed, nor did he think the Quran itself was written with bad intentions.
So the court recognized that these verses could be sensitive, but also stood by the principle of religious freedom and the importance of taking things in context.
Exactly. So the court ultimately decided there wasn't enough reason to believe the Quran promotes violence and hatred so much that it should be banned.
It's a really tricky situation, isn't it? Trying to balance the need for peace with the right to religious freedom.
Right. And that's why this case is so fascinating to examine. But we're not quite done yet, because now we're going to look at a counterargument presented in the book, Sita Ram Goel, the Calcutta Quran Petition.
This book gives a very different perspective on the Quran and how it has affected history.
So just keep in mind that what we're about to discuss is from a specific author's point of view, based on their own study of historical texts and events.
It's another set of insights for our listeners to think about.
So the author argues that if you look at the Quran within its historical context, especially by looking at traditional biographies of Prophet Muhammad and the Hadith, which are the Prophet's sayings and actions, then it actually paints a very different picture. He calls it a comprehensive compendium on continued and total war against the infidels.
Wow, a pretty strong statement and definitely a big difference from the court's perspective.
And the author goes on to say that the Allah of the Quran isn't really a separate entity from the Prophet Muhammad.
Interesting.
And to back this up, he uses Aisha's words about Allah being very quick to reveal commandments that were in line with what the Prophet wanted.
So this interpretation suggests there's a much closer connection between God's will and the Prophet's actions and desires than we might traditionally think.
Right. And then the author dives into the concept of Jihad bil Saif, which means striving by the sword as it's described in the Quran. And he references a book by Brigadier S.K. Malik called The Quranic Concept of War, which has a foreword by General Zia-ul Haq. And both of them really emphasize the military aspects of jihad.
So they're basically saying that armed struggle and the expansion of Islam are key to understanding its history.
And to support this argument, the author goes into detail about the military campaigns led by Prophet Muhammad called Ghazwas and Sariyas.
Right.
Saying these campaigns are clear proof of religiously motivated warfare from the very beginning of Islam.
So he's arguing these weren't just defensive wars, but part of a plan to spread the Islamic faith.
Right, and he uses specific historical events to illustrate his point, like the killing of Kabi al-Ashraf, the expulsion of the Banu Nadir Jewish tribe, the siege of the Banu Qurayza tribe, the conquest of Khaybar, and the killings after the conquest of Mecca.
He interprets all of these as actions driven by religion and Quranic principles.
Yeah, and the author also says that even though the Quran has verses against starting fights, they're kind of overshadowed by what he sees as more frequent and powerful commands to fight and conquer non-Muslims.
So he's basically saying there's a hierarchy of importance within the Quran.
And he looks at the position of non-Muslims, called zimmis, in a traditional Islamic state, using classic legal texts like the Hidayah, which is a big deal in Hanafi Islamic law.
I see.
And this analysis reveals what the author sees as discriminatory practices and a goal of reducing the number and influence of non-Muslims.
So this brings in the political side of things, arguing that the Quran's teachings can lead to the marginalization of non-Muslim communities.
Right, and the author provides more historical context by looking at jihads in India, led by various Muslim rulers throughout history, like Muhammad Qasim and Babur.
Right.
He points out the reasons they used for these campaigns, the destruction of temples, the killings and enslavement, and how these rulers saw themselves as mujahids or holy warriors fighting for Islam.
And he uses these examples to argue that the Quran's teachings on jihad have had a very real and often very violent impact on the history of India, especially how Muslim rulers treated their non-Muslim subjects.
Right, and then the author goes on to compare this interpretation to modern Islamic apologetics, which try to paint a picture of Islam as peaceful.
He mentions figures like Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru and Asghar Ali Engineer who have a more reconciliatory view, but expresses some doubt about these modern interpretations.
Yeah, it just shows that there's this ongoing debate about how to interpret Islamic texts and history.
And how those interpretations shape our understanding of the relationship between different faiths today.
And the book ends with a very thought-provoking statement, saying that as long as people interpret the Quran in certain ways and see non-Muslims as targets, the possibility of jihad is always there.
That's a powerful statement to end on.
So to sum it all up, you've heard two completely different points of view. The legal defense in the court case stressed the importance of peace, context, and the right to religious freedom.
Right.
While the author of the Calcutta Quran Petition argues that the Quran and its history paint a picture of constant conflict, where non-Muslims are targets of subjugation and religiously motivated warfare.
So our listeners have now seen both sides of this complex historical and legal debate, and it's up to them to decide how to make sense of it all.
And here's something for everyone to think about as you go about your day. After hearing all of these accounts and different ways of interpreting religious texts, how does all of this affect how we think about the relationship between religious texts, what happens in history, and the ongoing effort to find communal harmony?
It's a complicated question with no easy answers, but definitely worth pondering.
And to all of you watching on Book Reviews 1, we really hope this deep dive into such a significant historical and legal case has been thought-provoking and sparked some interesting ideas.
We'd love to hear what you all think.
Yeah, please share your thoughts and opinions down in the comments. And if you found this deep dive valuable, please give it a like, share it with others, and subscribe to Book Reviews 1 for more in-depth analyses of important texts and historical events.
Thanks for watching, everyone.
We appreciate you being here.